For more on this, I'm joined by Omar Baddar, a Palestinian-American political analyst. He joins me live from Washington, D.C. Thanks very much for being with us. Just to go back to the issue of pressure and the potential ceasefire, we've heard that Netanyahu has essentially said he'll carry on the operation, but we are getting some noises from Hamas that there might be a truce possibly within a day or two. How do you expect any possibility of a ceasefire to emerge in the next few days?
It's hard to tell specifically. However, we know that there is a long history of Israel engaging in massive atrocities against Palestinians and being resistant to any possibility of American pressure to change their behavior. We've seen it even with settlement building throughout the West Bank, where the United States demands an immediate end to that settlement expansion, and Israel simply disregards it and just carries on doing what they do. And this is probably another one of those cases where it's no different, because ultimately the Biden administration has come under pressure to merely rhetorically demand that Israel de-escalate. But the United States military funding of Israel continues completely untouched. And I think the Israeli leadership understands that this is ultimately a bluff, that there's not going to be action put where there are only words, and therefore they are completely free to carry on with their massive assault against Gaza's civilian population that is absolutely devastating. The population, you have reckless and indiscriminate bombing of civilian areas. You have half of the people killed are women and children, with more than 64 children killed so far, and the massive destruction of the infrastructure. These are war crimes that the United States is funding, and there's not going to be meaningful American pressure on Israel to change its behavior. It's primarily rhetorical because Biden is under pressure internally from his own party, as you mentioned.
How much has the signing of the Abraham Accords changed the dynamic in terms of what happens with the Palestine-Israel conflict? And given that several Gulf countries normalised relations with Israel, do you think that's changed the way things operate?
It has not really changed much of the way things operate, because many of the governments that have signed agreements with Israel were never in conflict with Israel in the first place. Ultimately, the conflict exists because Israel is denying Palestinians their basic rights, and that has continued before and after the signing of those accords. So all we've seen is that some Arab governments have broken the line that was presented through the Arab Peace Initiative, where the Arab world said that they would only normalize relations with Israel if Israel ended the occupation and respected Palestinian human rights. And we've seen that normalizing without getting those demands met essentially is going to merely encourage Israel to continue behaving the way it currently does. And so that has not really had much of an impact. The imbalance of power and the system of oppression and apartheid that Israel is imposing on Palestinians is merely getting stronger.
Tell me, the other big issue in the Biden in-tray is the attempts to restore the nuclear deal with Tehran, and those talks are currently underway in Vienna. How is that playing into how the US handles the Palestinian-Israeli issue?
Yeah, it's quite clear that you have two blunders in American foreign policy in the region. One is the moral stain on America's conscience in the fact that we support this brutal Israeli occupation over Palestinians. And then you have the strategic blunder, which is Biden's refusal to go back to the Iran nuclear deal, which is an absolutely common sense deal that prevents Iran from developing nuclear weapons and reduces the possibility for escalating tensions in the region and the possibility for direct confrontation with Iran or escalation with Iran's allies in the region as well. So there's simply no reason to move in that direction. And I think given the fact that because of Biden's failures on both fronts, we are witnessing the possibility for escalation increasing by the moment. And it's only, that's why we're seeing the significant pressure building. There is growing American awareness, and, people are becoming much more informed about these dynamics. And that's precisely why Biden is coming under intense pressure. We've seen several members of Congress take to the floor of the House, demanding that Biden hold Israel accountable and fundamentally shift his policy towards the region. This is not the kind of thing that we have seen in previous Israeli assaults, but certainly the dynamic is changing, and Biden is feeling that pressure. And I guess we'll see whether ultimately he chooses the path of common sense in pursuing what is both morally and strategically the correct course for U.S. policy, or whether he continues down the wrong, outdated path that he's currently on.
Yeah, just on that, I mean, the issue of weapons sales to Israel from the US, that's one of the areas that people are trying to put him under pressure on. But it doesn't sound as though that's actually going to change, does it? Or would I be wrong there?
Yeah, there is an effort in Congress to try to put an end to that sale, but it's, again, too soon to tell whether that effort is going to be successful. But it certainly points to the fundamental hypocrisy of this administration's policy, where, on the one hand, it claims that it's putting human rights first and that this is the driving force behind its policy. But on the other hand, they are supplying weapons to a rogue apartheid regime while it is actively bombing civilians. I mean, that hypocrisy really is on full display. and it's incredibly damaging to the reputation of the United States throughout the world and in the region. And it's obviously something that a lot of Americans are concerned about, which is why you see so many celebrities and members of Congress and just really the discourse shifting within the country that is outrage that is directed at the Biden administration for moving forward with this sale and with this unconditional policy of military funding for Israel and unconditional diplomatic protection that is preventing the United Nations from holding Israel accountable. There's a lot of pressure that is building against that as well.
Omar Baddar, thank you very much indeed for talking to us on Al Jazeera.
Thank you.